Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre for Text in the City, the series where we take books, plays and movies from the VCE English syllabus and study them with our mouths out loud on the stage. Today we are lucky enough to be studying the book Growing Up Asian in Australia, edited by the wonderful Alice Pung. It's an anthology of essays, articles, stories by Asian Australians. Let's just do a quick count of hands. Who's already kind of dived into here and had a bit of a read? Okay, good, excellent. Top points to all of you, and half top points to the rest of you. Yeah, you'll get there after today, I'm sure. So the book, edited by Alice Pung, of course, who is the author of Unpolished Gem, which is a memoir she published a few years ago, which was very popular and kind of tells the story of her life growing up Asian in the western suburbs of Melbourne. Has edited this book, got all the contributors to put together essays and stories. One of the contributors is sitting to my left today, Benjamin Law. Benjamin is a writer, a commentator, and his work has appeared in many places, including Frankie, The Monthly, Clio, Crikey, The Big Issue, The Griffith Review. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's enough.
Okay, that's enough. And of course, most importantly, in Growing Up Asian in Australia, we should just mention his book, The Family Law, which was published a couple of years ago now, which centres around his family, obviously, because the family law. Please make Ben very welcome. All right, so it's not very often that we get the actual authors or contributors to a VCE English text up here to talk about the work with us. So maybe let's kind of go back to when Growing Up Asian in Australia was in its embryonic form. How did you first get involved with the project?
I'm signed up to a lot of mailing lists, and a lot of my friends are obviously writers. So there was a call out for submissions from Alice Pung. There was an anthology coming out called Growing Up Asian in Australia. And I write full time, and I just thought that title, like Growing Up Asian in Australia, like that's me. So obviously I had to contribute, and I knocked up some stories. For a long time I'd been writing for a magazine called Frankie. Are there any Frankie readers in the audience, perhaps? Yep. And my editor at Frankie had really encouraged a lot of us writers to write about our own lives, to develop our voice. So over the years, I've written about, my mum and the weird advice she's given us over the years. My mum is a bit of a character, as some of you would know if you've read my book or some of my articles. And then I thought, as time has gone on, writing for Frankie especially, I'd had all these experiences, especially in adolescence, that I could mine. And when it came to a submission about growing up Asian in Australia, I thought I'd expand on some of those stories a little bit more. Like I touched on things like not looking or feeling particularly manly before, which I'd expanded upon in this book. I touched upon my parents splitting up when I was 12 years old, and I thought this would be a really good opportunity to make those stories, to sort of get the definitive versions of those stories down, because Frankie's a magazine, so a lot of their stories are about 700 words long. And I thought, yeah, maybe I can actually write them to length, to what those stories should be. And then I sent them off, and I didn't hear back from them for ages, and I thought, oh my God, what a failure. I was really embarrassed. But they eventually got back to me, and they said the reason they were deliberating so long is they wanted to see if they could put 2 of my stories in, which I was very happy about.
And to see how patient you were.
That's right. They like to test you and freak you out a little bit sometimes, publishers.
Was there anything like that kind of at your school or on your kind of studying list when you were growing up? Kind of where could you go for an insight into growing up or being Asian in Australia?
Nowhere, actually. It's funny, like I think looking back at these stories and the stories that I've written for my book, The Family Law, I don't think I was doing it consciously, but I think now, looking back, I was trying to write the type of stories I would have wanted to read as a teenager, and I didn't find those stories anywhere. I do remember, though, I grew up in a place called Kawana on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, really surfy and beachy, just like me. No, I was a total book nerd, so I didn't fit at all. And I would always, especially as a teenager, spend a lot of time at my local library. You know, it was free books, fantastic. And they had just released released around that time the film version of a book called The Joy Luck Club. And, as a young teenage boy, for some reason, this movie about Asian American women really resonated for me. And I found myself very moved by it. I still cannot watch that film without crying. It's really pathetic. And so I found out that this film, The Joy Luck Club, was based on a book by Amy Tan, and she'd actually released a lot of novels by that stage about this experience of growing up Asian American. And of course Amy Tan comes from a different country, she's from a different generation, but those themes about not quite getting your folks, they resonated with me, about not quite looking or feeling the same as everyone else. Totally got that. And that was probably the first time where I felt that's a voice I identify with.
It's interesting, kind of in the anthology, a number of the stories feature parents who get Japanese movies or Chinese kind of serials sent over, and that's their media. That's how they kind of in a media way kind of celebrate that they are and kind of remember who they are. And did your parents do that?
I don't think in a conscious way. My dad was sort of the centre of the business world in the Asian Australian community on the Sunshine Coast. So some of you might be able to identify with this. Like, my dad was a restaurateur, but he was also all these other things as well, and he was the centre of this VHS Chinese movie. To call it a racket sounds sordid, but like a network where they would exchange VHS tapes of like Hong Kong serials that you couldn't get in Australia unless you had some sort of illegal satellite dish planted on top of your roof. So they would tape them from Hong Kong, and then that tape would be transferred to another tape halfway to Australia, and that would be transferred to another VHS tape. It was like the horror movie The Ring, except no one died. And by the time they got to Australia, they were really fuzzy. You couldn't really make out what was happening. All the colours were bleeding, and they would end up in my place as well. So when my dad would finish work, he'd come back. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. If we had to wake up and go pee, we'd go and hang out with Dad and fall asleep on the couch again. But I don't know. Like, I never really got into the soap opera vibe. I was more a home and away kid. But my sisters loved that stuff. So, and as a result, they speak better Cantonese than me.
Your dad kind of ran a lot of, I don't want to say racketeering businesses either, because it's your story. But he had an Asian grocery at one point. He had a Thai restaurant. Like kind of all kind of Asian stereotypes.
Totally.
And then there's this, in the story in there about the tourism, there's that kind of great line where you go to the theme park and you and your siblings are like, we are not Asian tourists. We are not Asian tourists, and we are going to do everything we can to not be Asian tourists, to distinguish ourselves from the others.
Yeah, we're going to like wear our pants below our navels. We refuse to have bum bags. We will talk in really thick bogan accents to make sure that everyone knows we're not those types of Asian tourists. It's weird what goes on in your head sometimes.
So do you embrace the Asian stereotype, or was a lot of your childhood spent and your teenage years spent rejecting it?
I think growing up, a lot of time was spent rejecting it, just because there weren't that many Asian people around. It's interesting though, like I talk to my friends now who are also Asian Australian, and they talk about how there were even distinctions, even if they went to a school where there were a lot of fellow Asian Australian kids, that there would be different types of Asian Australian kids in the schoolyard, and you had to sort of pick and choose which Asian Australian gang you were. Like, were you the Aussie-born sporty Asian Australians, or were you the ones who were born overseas and spoke Cantonese or Mandarin at lunchtime? Were you those types of Asian Australians, and could you mix with each other, or was that like gang warfare, or like you were always sort of reassessing where you fit in? And in my school, like I think in my year level, I was one of 5 Asian Australian kids with some Eurasian kids as well, and I don't know if it was a conscious thing, but I don't think any of us really hung out with each other.
Gee, I've seen Chris Lilly's programs before, and I thought they were just hot Asians.
Yeah, totally. And if I had a gang, that would be it. But yeah, it's funny though, because as time goes on, I'm older now. I'm 29, and you think about what an Asian stereotype is supposed to be. I mean, like, look, I'm pretty bookish. I really love books. I study really hard, and when I see, there's a Tumblr on the internet called asiansleepinginlibraries.tumblr.com, and, I sleep in libraries. Sometimes I work or study so hard that I fall asleep. And stereotypes exist, of course, and sometimes they can be bruising and offensive, but I think sometimes they exist because there is an element of truth in them. And I tend to nowadays sort of embrace them. I mean, look, I did a thesis on this sort of stuff actually at university where I talked about stereotypes, and sometimes I think stereotypes actually need to be embraced rather than rejected, because if you actually explore the stereotype, that's when you can subvert it, or that's when you can add an extra dimension to it. Just by saying, an Asian man who runs a restaurant is a stereotype, well, that's not true in and of itself. If you put that on the page or put that on the screen and that's all the man was, then I think that's possibly a stereotype. But if he's a three-dimensional character who's very complex, and hopefully I portray my dad like that in my book, who has needs and desires, who has faults as well, who can be funny but who can be sad, then I think jobs alone or characterizations alone in and of themselves aren't necessarily a stereotype or a bad thing. It's if they're one-dimensional.
Yeah, I mean, people do say that there are stereotypes for a reason, that they are...
Totally. Look, I really love yum cha and theme parks. Don't hold it against me.
Touching back again on kind of the schoolyard and kind of growing up Asian in the schoolyard, I was kind of struck as I was reading Growing Up Asian in Australia again this week, the number of scenarios in the essays and stories where there'll be one Asian kid in the schoolyard and they'll be kind of surrounded by white kids, and they'll either be kind of verbally or physically assaulted or just kind of prodded or treated as a curiosity. Did you have similar experiences growing up in the schoolyard?
It's weird. When the book Growing Up Asian in Australia came out, and reading those experiences pop up again and again, they weren't surprising or foreign to me because, for instance, my cousin had horrible experiences at the school she went to. Every day at her school was pretty hellish, actually. She was constantly picked on, not just for her race but for other things as well, but race certainly was a dimension as to why she was targeted out. So that didn't surprise me that that's a recurring theme. And my Asian Australian friends now, when we talk about school experiences, those things certainly happened. For some reason, I got away. I sort of somehow flew under the radar. I did go to a school where I was one of very few Asian kids, so I really did stick out. And not just because of my race, because, not only was I Asian, I was a scrawny clarinet playing Asian, really unsexy, and not sporty, slightly gangly, constantly had orthodontic work just shoved into my face. If it wasn't a plate, I had braces. If I didn't have braces, I had some sort of head. It was just wrong. And so I really, for all intents and purposes, and burgeoning homosexual, should have been destroyed in the schoolyard. But I don't know. I think bullying sometimes is completely by luck. And I feel like if I was in the year level above or the year level below or in another school, my high school experience especially could have been hellish, but I was very, very lucky. And in primary school especially, I think what made me lucky was that I started primary school in 1988 in Queensland, and 1988 in Queensland was all about Brisbane Expo and multiculturalism, so it was this really cool thing if you came from another culture, because we were all interested in the pavilions.
You weren't just there for Expo?
No, that's right. No, we actually migrated for Expo. No. So we were part of this time where being from another race or culture was cool. I'd bring my chopsticks with my lunchbox and would give, people wanted chopstick lessons in the schoolyard. So for some reason, and I think it's totally to do with timing, being ethnically, racially different was sort of currency for me. I was lucky.
I love how you describe in your writing how when you're at high school, it didn't really occur to the kids that you might be Asian and gay.
Yeah, no one can really pick. You have to be one or the other.
Yeah. And I wondered if you were insecure about being gay and or Asian, or whether they just kind of compounded into one big kind of...
Gaysian mess, yeah.
I didn't want to say it, but thank you.
It was interesting. Like I wasn't out in high school, but you know, in the back of your head, you sort of know. But you know, looking back, it's probably quite obvious. You know, like I didn't do any of the sciences. I did all of the performing arts and art subjects. Hung around with girls. Really was into jump rope for heart. You know, that was like my chosen charity and athletic pursuit of choice. I don't know. It wasn't really, you know, I wasn't outwardly, I guess, maybe obvious. I somehow flew under the radar about that stuff. And I think, you know, a lot of, this is a huge generalisation, but I think one of the reasons why, you know, queer guys are often in the performing arts is because they've had to perform all their lives. You know, you've had to sort of fly under the radar, maybe be slightly butch, examine how people walk, talk about girls that are attractive even though you don't find them attractive at all, or, you know, not that they're ugly, but, you know, you don't find them sexually attractive. And so you sort of put on that sort of act about yourself. I don't know.
Did you learn in high school how to use your kind of Asian background as a point of difference, as like something to actually trade on, like you do now?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example. It's interesting. I recently had breakfast with a friend of mine who I'm not going to name, but she's also Asian Australian, but she lives in this city, so see if you can find her. And we were talking about how sometimes when she meets new people, as a tick, she nervously starts doing all these Asian impersonations of herself or her mother or relatives that she knows. It's almost like she becomes this vaudeville act of Asian stereotypes to make people okay with the fact, to allow people to be comforted by the fact that she is Asian in case they're uncomfortable with it. And I was completely appalled, but I sort of related to it as well. Like sometimes you can ham up your Asianness as a bit of a joke, but I'm not sure that's entirely PC. I don't know, the politics of this are really interesting.
Yeah. What age were you when you realised kind of...
I was Asian.
You were... Yeah. What's the answer to that question?
You know, to be honest, you know, if you know William Young, the photographer and the speaker, he does have a story where he grew up in far north Queensland, I think, and he does have this story where he didn't actually realise he was Chinese until the school kids started taunting him with like Ching Chong Chinaman born in a jar, that sort of thing. And he went home to his mum and he said, "Oh my God, Mum, are we Chinese?" And she's like, "Yes, we are Chinese." And then his brother said, "Yeah, and you're going to have to get used to it." And so it was presented as this really horrible thing. But I think I was a bit more advanced. I knew I was Asian from a pretty young age.
Yeah, even subconsciously, there must be something in your brain at some point that is like, all right, but I'm a little bit different to a lot of the other kids.
Totally. Yeah. Especially in grade 1, I remember there was one other girl, Lydia Yench, and another girl, Nuri. We were the only ethnics. We actually hung out together and formed like this little gang of like ethnic cool kids. And yeah, you do recognise that you are different. It wasn't until I was 12 years old that I went to Hong Kong for the first time, because that's where my folks are either from or that's where they've sort of migrated through. And it was completely comforting and completely disorientating to be in Hong Kong. I still remember the first time I went over there, because there was this rush of comfort, like, oh my God, everyone looks like me and everyone is talking Cantonese, which I associate with private space. You know, like this is the language of home. I never really hear it spoken in a public space. And to hear that, and the whole world was suddenly my family and my living room, I still remember being completely awed and sort of freaked out by it at the same time.
Yeah. One of the things in the anthology that kind of came up time and time again was authors kind of talking about being at school, growing up, just wanting to be like the other white kids, just wanting to be the same as everyone else, and then kind of growing up and realising that not only were they different and Asian, but that there was actually something really special about that, and wanting to kind of honour their heritage, and that like awful kind of, I don't know, 3 to 4 year like space where you're both of those things. Did you have that 3 to 4 year gap?
I remember when I finished high school, I was at university, and I was completely ashamed by the fact that my Cantonese is appalling. So for those of you who speak Cantonese really, really well, come up to me, I'll completely understand what you're saying, and I'll try to talk back to you, and you will think that I've had a stroke or something, because it's really, really bad. And my partner, Scott, he thought, because he's really white, and he thought that it was a real shame that I had this Cantonese that was obviously dormant in the back of my brain, that I could completely understand, that needed to be unlocked, and if I had lessons I could speak it. But I'll write about this in my book as well, but I was so bad at the lessons, and it was so appalling that I could understand what my teacher was saying, but I couldn't speak it back. So I have tried over the years to reclaim my Canto, because if you watch home videos, if I watch home videos of myself as a kid, I'm like, wow, that kid is awesome at Cantonese. Like, how did he get so good? And of course it's me. It's just not the fact that he was good. It's just that I've gotten really, really bad.
Is there a weird guilt that comes with not knowing it anymore?
Totally. And you try to reclaim that sort of stuff by speaking the language or trying to get better at it. I recently met Po Ling Yao. You guys know Po from, formerly MasterChef and now Po's Kitchen. And the way that she talks about food is very similar. Like, she started cooking a lot of the meals from her Chinese Malaysian family to get back in touch with those roots, to sort of connect with her past, because, she's had a story of migration that's quite interesting as well. And, like, for a while, Po's name was Sharon. That's how Aussie she really wanted to present herself for a while. And then she reclaimed her name and tried to get back through cooking. So I relate to that.
It's interesting that you mentioned Po and kind of like talk about kind of the wider acceptance, I guess, of Asian Australians kind of in the media. And just looking at the book kind of now and reading it, a number of the writers have gone on to be published authors and to kind of like lead, successful kind of writing careers. I mean, Leanne Hall has 2 published YA novels now. Tom Cho had his first novel published after that. Look Who's Morphing. Oliver Pomervan had a couple of kids' books published after it. Tanva Ahmed, The Exotic Risol, was turned into a book. Like, Alice Pung talks about how, when she was growing up, the stories of Asian Australians weren't part of the general, narrative of Australia. That surely now has changed.
Yeah, I think we've formed this literary mafia that's trying to take over the bookshelves, which is good. You're right, all those voices that have come out, and some of them are talking about the Asian Australian experience, and some of them aren't. They're just incidentally just writers writing about all sorts of subject matter. And I think that's important. I mean, when I was growing up, because I was such a huge book nerd, I can't really remember if there was anyone that I really looked up to in terms of someone that I wanted to be. Maybe, that film Almost Famous, there's the Rolling Stone editor, Ben Fong Torres. I still remember thinking, Ben Fong Torres is cool. But besides Ben Fong Torres, no one else.
You never saw yourself as an Amy Tan?
No. Oh, no, sometimes. No.
Now, the book's been out for 5 years now, and it's been on the VCE lists for a couple of years as well. Do people talk to you about it all the time? What kind of reactions do people have about it to you?
It's interesting. It was actually interesting talking to the other writers in the book, and how all of our experiences were completely different, obviously. Like, there is a diversity of experiences in this book. But I think there are some veins of common themes that run throughout it, those feelings of not quite getting what your parents are saying and them not quite getting what you're saying. There's always that conversation between kids and their parents where, I mean, how many of you have heard from your parents, I don't get what you're saying? Or how many of you have said that to your parents back? I don't get what you're saying. And what's interesting is I think, migrant families especially, is that can literally be the case with linguistic barriers. Sometimes you literally don't know what the other person is saying.
It's the perfect metaphor for adolescence.
Exactly. So I think all those issues about adolescence, and I think that's why this book resonates with a lot of people, because it is not just about being Asian in Australia, but it's about growing up Asian in Australia, that period of change, that period of becoming an adult, that period of trying to figure out who you are. I think that's what resonates with people, whether they're Asian Australian or not. All those themes are pretty universal about trying to get who you are and the people that you come from.
Yeah, you could almost take Asian out of the title and replace it with immigrant, talking like, growing up as an immigrant in Australia.
Exactly, which is sort of, a lot of Australia. So I think over 50% of all Australians are either born overseas or have parents who are born overseas. So that is the Australian story.
Yeah. We're going to take questions in a couple of minutes. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Ben about growing up Asian in Australia or growing up or being Asian, he's ready for them. So prepare your questions. I want to ask you, Alice Pung's, she speaks in the introduction to the book, and in fact, if you're looking for kind of like an extra kind of study resource, there's an introduction that Alice Pung wrote to the book that she didn't actually include in the book, and it goes into like the history of kind of Asians in Australia a little bit more, and it's online on her blog and worth looking up. But in that she talks about the labels that Asian Australians have kind of been given, and at first they were the yellow peril, and then they were the model minority, the kind of condescending label that most recently they've had attached to them. In 2012, kind of where are Asian Australians now?
I think in 2012 you genuinely can't pin us down. I think other people might try to. Look, I think moving slightly away from the Australian context, but I think someone like Jeremy Lin being an NBA superstar all of a sudden, I think he's a pretty good example of how preconceptions of Asians have changed. Look, Asians in the NBA, that's still a surprising thing for a lot of people, and probably a lot of us in this room as well. But that dismantling still has to happen. But I think Asian Australian is still a term that might carry some baggage, but it's getting reduced. And I think the more visibility we have, especially in the media, that's becoming less of an issue. I think, what I think has done a lot of good, weirdly enough, and even though we're at a book event, this will sound completely sacrilegious, but reality TV has actually done a lot. I just think of like MasterChef contestants or people who have been on Australian Idol, like Jessica Malboy is half Indonesian, and those expectations, Asians can't sing or Asians can't, they're not naturally athletic or whatever. Those are starting to get slowly dismantled. But those preconceptions are still there, I think.
And that's kind of strange because the casting of reality shows is just as strict as the casting of a pre-recorded sitcom.
Yeah, totally.
We might throw over to Q&A now. If you have a question for Ben, there are people with microphones in their hands. If you wave at them, they will come to you. It's your best opportunity to ask a question in the next 15 minutes of anyone. Whilst we're waiting for a question, I might ask another one. And I guess it's just about isolation, and if you felt not isolated as a kid, because it sounds like you did all right for an Asian in a school in the 80s in Australia, but whether you kind of felt a familial kind of isolation, whether you felt like your family was very isolated from the rest of the Australian community or the society you were living in.
Yeah. What's interesting is, because my family was so big, there were 5 kids and 2 parents, I actually think I felt a little bit isolated from the rest of the Chinese Australian community around us at the time. Like, we certainly knew each other, but I didn't necessarily feel like maybe we had much in common.
Okay, because the assumption would be that they'd be your people, and that that's kind of where you'd hang, and where that there wasn't a connection there.
There was, but to another extent, I think what changed it was when my parents split up when I was 12 years old, and that was seen as a huge no-no in Chinese culture, especially of their generation as well. So we didn't exactly become pariahs, but it was a little bit scandalous to everyone else. So they felt that they needed to keep their distance. So that added an extra sort of complicating dimension to our relationship with the Chinese Australian community in my area, I think. Yeah.
All right. Questions down the front? Yeah.
Yes. I'm a school teacher, and I was just interested to know, Well, we're rare tonight, aren't we? I was actually wanting to know about the expectations you have with your parents. You mentioned also just then about the separation. That was part of your story. And that's quite common. That's a common thread with a lot of the stories. But we're all fascinated when we're studying this, the story, the anthology, about the expectations a lot of the parents have on their children.
Yeah.
What was your experience with that?
Again, we were sort of anomalies when it came to this. When you asked that question, I immediately thought of my cousins, actually. So, of my mum's siblings, she was one of 7 siblings, and her sister also lived in the same area on the Sunshine Coast. So, we were the 2 families that were related to each other closely, and it was odd seeing how they were being raised, because they had to become engineers, they had to become accountants, they had to get A's because B was this shameful letter of the alphabet, and they were completely threatened with, corporal punishment to emotional violence, and I just thought that was always so full on and intense, those expectations. But I think how my family was different, and maybe I'm making generalisations, but because there were 5 of us, it's really hard to discipline 5 kids at a time. So we were sort of free-range organic children who ran amok and probably had the upper hand on our parents just by sheer numbers alone. And I did remember my dad saying, it would be great if you were a doctor. And I just thought, that's not going to happen. Sorry. And so what my parents were actually good at is that they fostered not pressure as such, but this idea that studying and getting good grades was really, really good. It wasn't that they were emphasising the negative stuff, which I saw a lot of other Asian Australian parents doing, which was just like, if you fail, that's bad. If you get a B, that's bad. They were saying, if you get an A, that's awesome. But if you get a B, that's awesome. You could probably do better, but that's pretty good as well. They were actually pretty good in that way, and complete. When I talked to my other Asian Australian friends, I realised they were complete freaks as well in that sense, like a sort of outliers in terms of that sort of parenting approach. I think they were good. Their main thing was do exactly what you want, because I think both of them recognised that they were both doing things that they didn't necessarily want to do. I don't think my dad wanted to work in a restaurant 7 nights a week to support 5 kids. I don't think my mum necessarily wanted to look after 5 kids full time. So I think amongst the kids and amongst my parents as well, we both recognised that they had sacrificed a lot. And our obligation, unlike a lot of my Asian Australian peers, weren't to become doctors, but to do exactly what we wanted to do, but make sure we were good at it and could earn money off it.
Are they proud of you now?
Are they? Yes. Yeah, they're very good. They're very maybe too proud of me.
Okay. You should have been a doctor and just tone things right down.
Yeah, that's right. In the end, I actually did become a doctor, but a doctor of literature, and I don't think that's what my dad necessarily thought of at the time.
Questions? Yep.
So just growing up Asian, what do you think had more effect on you, like the outlook that society had upon you as being an Asian, or the expectations of your parents to be Asian in a way?
Be Asian. Yeah. That's a tricky question.
Did you play up to the stereotypes, the Asian stereotypes that kind of your non-family environment?
Look, this question actually reminds me of something. Actually, both of these questions remind me of something weird that my siblings did a couple of years ago. There are 5 of us, so you can we can sort of rank each other in surveys, and we did this survey called "Which Sibling is Most Asian?" And there were 10 criteria. So there was stuff like how much do you hold on to Asian values? How much do you like Asian food? How good are you at cooking Asian food? How well do you speak Cantonese? How many Asian friends do you have? How attracted are you to Asian people? How attractive are you to Asian people? And we'd rank each other on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on an ascending scale. And it turned out that my younger sister Tammy is the most Asian, just so you know. And but that's that sort of thing. You are a little bit self-conscious about your identity, and you are constantly questioning how Asian am I, or am I Asian enough? And then that builds into another question, which is, what does Asian actually mean? And in an Australian context, that's a really interesting question as well, because I think most Australians in some ways are some sort of hyphenated Australian, whether you're an Indian Australian or a Greek Australian. You know, John Howard famously said he doesn't believe in hyphenated Australians, but I think all of us are hyphenated in some ways. You know, we're parents, or we're kids, or we're fans of some particular music artist, or we've got an ethnic background. Like, we're all jumbles, really. Yeah. But thanks for your question. It's a good one.
Yeah, down the back.
There's a couple of stories in the anthology that reference homosexuality. Did that create a void between you and your family at all? Or
where is that question coming from? Hand? Okay, cool. Hi. Yeah, I was luckier. Again, it goes. I keep bringing up like my cousin's family, but one of my cousins is queer as well, and I know she had a much more rough time of it than I did. I think my mum. Look, my mum's odd, and that's great, and it's like, she's odd in the best possible ways, I think, because she was really open-minded, and I think she rebelled slightly against her siblings, who are more conservative. You know, we've met them; they're more traditional Chinese. Whereas my mum's a little bit crazy, and she's the type of person who will call us into the room if there is a sex scene on TV and say, "Oh my God, there's sex on TV, you've got to watch this," which I don't think is typical of Asian mothers or mothers. And so I already had the feeling that once I came out to my mum, which I did at the age of 17, that she'd be relatively okay with it, and she was. You know, as I write in the book, you know, she said to me, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with being gay. It just means that something went wrong in the womb, and that's not your fault." Which was comforting at the time.
So she blamed herself.
Yeah, basically, she blamed herself. And my dad is much more traditional Chinese, and he was the last to know, which I always feel bad about, because I really didn't know how he would react. He's a very different person to my mother, and when I look back at what happened when I told him, which was over the phone, he was okay with it. He said, "Look, that's fine. It's a very popular thing nowadays. And maybe one day you'll decide to be normal, but if you don't, that's also okay." And which, I mean, like, we can read all sorts of messed up stuff in that sort of series of sentences. But for him, I think that was a really big and brave thing to say. And I think what actually changed things was that for a very long time, well, for maybe the last 3 or 4 years before I came out to my father, his second in charge at the restaurant was like this super gay Thai guy. And super gay Thai guy and my dad really got along well, and my dad really respected super gay Thai guys' work ethic, because it's something that I think Chinese dads, my dad especially, really values, someone who really applies himself to work. And being openly gay, was just an incidental other part of his life. So my dad sort of got accustomed to it, whereas I think someone like my cousin, there weren't any gay people in their ecosystem at all. So for one of their children to be gay, it was this huge, scandalous, heartbreaking, earth-shattering event, which I think it is still for a lot of parents.
So you were lucky.
I was really lucky, you know. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, yep.
You sort of touched on this earlier, and I'm not really sure the best way to ask this question, but I guess most simply, how comfortable are you with the umbrella term Asian?
Asian? I don't know, I use it a lot. I think I've said it a lot today. I'm writing a book at the moment which is non-fiction, and it's more journalism based, and it is about Asia. And when I started writing the book, I'm like, how do you even define what Asia is? Like, geographically, you can sort of map out the continent, But within that continent are so many cultures. And for those of us who have spent any time in the UK, you know that Asian usually refers to people who like are Indian or Pakistani, and you have to say Oriental to talk about East Asians. Whereas for us, you know, like I've spoken to young people before, and they talk about Asians and Indians as if India, and I'm like, where do you think India is? And they're just like, isn't that its own thing? So I think all of us have different constructs of what Asia is. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't know how to answer it. It's a little bit of an abstract concept, I guess. Geographically, even, you can include parts of the Middle East, and that's contested as to whether those parts of the world are parts of Asia, technically, as well. My thing is I usually go by the Asian Games. You know, like, they've got their own sort of Commonwealth Games, and I'm like, whatever countries are a part of that in any given year, that's Asia to me now. That's fine. It's hard to define.
Are you more comfortable with Asian Australian
than Chinese Australian?
Or than just Asia?
Like if people just call me Asia, or
yeah, hey Asia.
Yeah, I feel like both are fine. Like I'm Australian, but as a citizen, that's how I identify myself when I go overseas. I think the Asian thing's sort of obvious to most people, so I don't usually have to talk about it, but in terms of like defining myself, yeah, like Asian, Australian, I think most of us, like I said before, are a mix of a few things, so that is probably one of the foremost ways how I introduce or explain myself.
Yep.
Yeah.
How are we going for more questions? One down the back? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, me again.
Hi.
In terms of belonging within the anthology, where do you feel you belong the most? Do you think that you can fit in Hong Kong, like you were talking about before, or do you feel that it is Australia that you resonate most with? Or I'm just curious.
Mean like if I'm going from country to country, where do I feel most comfortable?
Yeah.
Australia, definitely. Like I've spent most of my life in Australia. I was born in Australia. I was born in Nambour. You know, that's where Kevin Rudd was born. You have to pronounce it like that when you get there as well. And, you know, because I come from Brisbane, I come from Queensland, and generally there are more bogans there. So there is this inner bogan in me all the time that I carry as much as my Asian heritage. And I don't think that they're completely distinguishable or apart from each other. They inform each other as well. Like, you go to far north Queensland and there are the most bogan Asian Australians you will ever meet, you know, like shorts, scratching themselves, and it's amazing, it's awesome. So I think, you know, people sometimes ask, do you see yourself more as Asian or more Australian? And for me, that question is almost like asking someone who might be a teacher and a mum and a wife, do you see yourself more as a wife or a mum or a teacher? You know, that you are all of those things, and those things actually interact with each other as well. And I think when you're the minority, you're in any way, whether you're gay or whether you're an ethnic minority, you're forced to think about identity more. But, you know, for instance, like white heterosexual people, those things are a sexuality, and those things are an ethnicity or race as well. You know, there is such a thing as Caucasian, and there is such a thing as being heterosexual. And I'm a firm embracer of the heterosexual people and their community. But those are also identifying markers that people just sort of take for granted. They never think of themselves in a racial or sexual dimension, but it's there.
I think there's another whole book there, growing up bogan Asian in Australia.
Totally. I'll write it.
We are time for one more quick question. Mm-hmm. Yep.
You know how you talk about that you didn't find it that hard to fit in when you were younger? Did you see that your parents struggled more to fit in because the culture is so different to what they were used to when they were younger?
Yeah.
In Australia?
That's a really good point. You know, my parents, especially my mum, like my dad had spent a little time in Sydney before, so he'd already figured out or got in his mind an idea of what Australia was. And then when he married my mum in Hong Kong, she took this incredible leap of faith where she was coming to a country that she'd never visited before. And I mean, by the time I was born, which was like the early 80s, they came to Australia in the mid-70s. They had adjusted more, they'd made friendships, they'd acclimatised to the culture. They actually preferred the culture in Australia, they preferred the space. They were sort of sick of the stickle brick housing of Hong Kong. They couldn't really breathe there. But when my mum first came here, you know, she described Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast as a ghost town, literally, because not only were there very few people there, everyone was really white as well. And so she I think had a hard time figuring out where she belonged in this mix. And I don't know, like, for those of us who have parents who are migrants, for me at least, it wasn't until I was an adult that I thought of myself, like, my mum at this age already had this many children and was raising them in an environment that was still relatively foreign to her, you know, this huge leap. So there were all those adjustment processes that they had to deal with that we took completely for granted. Yeah.
We are totally out of time. It's been fantastic having you here. Please thank Benjamin Law.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Andrew.